great to be part of this whole event. I'm loving it and want to thank everybody involved. It's a whole group effort. But for right now, I have the sincere honor of introducing Archer Mayer. Before I forget it, let me direct you to his website if you want any more info than what I provide. It's archermayer.com. Archer Mayer is the author of over 30 mystery novels set in Vermont, starring police detective Joe Gunther. It's a series of novels that the Chicago Tribune described as, quote, the best police procedurals being written in America, end quote. That accolade is probably due in part to Mr. Mayer's meticulous research, including his actual field experience as a detective, a volunteer firefighter, an EMT, and a death investigator for Vermont's Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, a position he continues to hold today. Mr. Mayer has worked plenty of other jobs as a scholarly editor, a researcher for Time Life Books, a political advance man, a theater photographer, a newspaper writer-editor, a lab technician in Paris, France, and a medical illustrator. Before turning his hand to fiction, he wrote history books also. Mr. Mayer has the honor of being the first writer of crime literature to earn the New England Independent Booksellers Association Award for Best Fiction. And he continues to enjoy the work that he does in the field, in his research, and with his writing, as I'm sure you'll hear as he presents to us today. One of his favorite parts of the job is answering readers' questions. The way we're going to handle questions today is that Mr. Mayer will talk for a while, and then we'll transition to a Q&A session. During that question and answer session, if you would please use the hand raise function on Zoom to indicate that you have a question, I'll be able to call on you and Lise will unmute you and you can ask your question. If you have trouble finding that, let us know via chat or Q&A. If you click on the participant button, you should be able to find yourself and try clicking on the 3 arrows to find the raise hand function. Try looking at the bottom of the screen. It's a little different on every screen, but we'll use that hand raise function and I'll call on you to ask questions during the question and answer session. Rest assured, there will be time for that at the end of his presentation. But for now, please let me hand it over to, and please join me in welcoming Archer Mayer. I think you're on, Mr. Mayer.
Mr. Mayer's audio is still connecting. So we'll just give it a minute.
All right. I hope people have had the opportunity to grab some of his books from the Dickinson Library. We have many. He's written over 30. We have almost a complete collection. They are often checked out, but come back to us and you'll be able to get your chance with them too. It looks like I can see that he's still trying to connect as well. While he's connecting, let me tell you a little bit about our summer library program. Oh, maybe he's on. No, maybe not. At least just let me know.
We're still
let me know when you come. Okay. The summer library program is coming up. Despite the pandemic, we're still going to have a summer library program. It is called Imagine Your Story, and it's going to be 6 weeks from July 6th to August 16. If you are in Northfield, watch for something to come to your mailbox that has all the details. We'll be keeping track of our reading on an online Beanstack, which you'll get right through the library website. And one really exciting thing in this Imagine Your Story summer program is that Lise will be directing a writing workshop. Please join us for that if you are interested. It looks like Mr. Mayer is on with the sound.
Yep, he's all set, and I'll just spotlight him now. Thank you.
Fantastic. Welcome, Mr. Mayer. Oh, he's muted.
Oh, Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Ah, excellent. Okay. I have no idea. We did a little test run earlier. Everything worked magnificently. And of course, when we're hot, we're not. But here I am with apologies.
Thanks so much for being here.
Great to have you. We've given you your intro. I don't know if you had a chance to hear that, but it
Oh,
was
good Lord, no, I didn't hear a thing. No.
well, the stage is yours. Please take it away. We'll do as we discussed, we'll do after you speak for a while, we'll do a Q&A when you're all set.
Yes. Well, of course, then I therefore am guaranteed to have been introduced as someone who participated in the 1916 Bolshevik overthrow of the previous Tsarist regime, which means I'm looking pretty good for a man of my age. Having said that, we segue over to Joe Gunther, the interminable, unkillable, unaging, sweetest revenge of a gray-haired writer. Because Joe, as we all know, is now the proverbial 39 years old, whose birthday is next year. So be prepared. He's about to enter middle age. This being a man who began life in 1988 in open season as a Korean War veteran who was considering retirement. I, of course, cannot consider retirement, not because this is a sob story about the struggling writer, but rather I've become more addicted to Joe Gunther and his series of books than perhaps any of my readers, which is saying something since they've been with me solidly for 30 plus books. I say plus books because it takes me a year to write a book. It takes a publisher a year to publish a book. And of course, in the meantime, I'm writing the third book after that. So I'm actually happily ensconced in entry number 32 if I weren't being so pleasantly interrupted right now. Joe Gunther began, just to sort of give you a nutshell for those few of you who actually did expect a lecture on the Bolshevik Revolution. You're in for some trouble. I write murder mysteries, Vermont-based police procedurals, to be precise, which I was told rather severely when I attended my first writers' meeting in 1988. And she said, "What do you write?" And I said, "Well, it's a murder mystery convention, so I write those." And she looked at me witheringly. And I was educated that I write police procedurals, hard police procedurals, regionally based, comma, whatever. Anyhow, I created Joe Gunther because I was, although appreciative, I was a little tired of the overly burdened, turned inside out, long suffering, angst riddled, alcoholic, 4 times divorced heroes that seem to be plodding around the neighborhood when Joe Gunther first appeared. Instead, I wanted to write about someone who was thoughtful, a team player, avuncular, hardworking. In other words, possibly the most boring hero in the history of literature. The idea was how to make this guy a hero. Well, of course, you surround him with misfits for one thing, and part of his heroicism becomes the fact that he can manage other people who are clearly unmanageable. And thus, without even having set out with this concept in mind, I very quickly gave birth to a troupe, or an ensemble, if you will, of actors who have never abandoned me. I can mention to the tried and the true things like Willie and now Sally and Rachel and Lester and Sammy, and just first names only. And much like Cher, immediately an image pops to mind. And it's because I really have created a family, alter egos, ways that have assisted me as a writer and as a human being to process my life and bring my insights and my education to you guys. So this is a collaborative effort, and I want it to be ongoing. I want it to be challenging to me as well as to you. So every book will be written as a full-fledged new novel. I will sooner run the risk of you're saying, oh, I didn't like this entry all that much. I will sooner run the risk of that rather than saying, oh, isn't that nifty? Book number 14 is just like book number 1. He's stuck to the tried and true. These are not, as I mentioned to that very pleasant young man who interviewed me for the local newspaper, these are not whodunits. They are whydunits. And why falls to what makes us function as human beings. I've had life experiences, as have we all. I have then immersed myself further by being a death investigator, law enforcement, EMS, ski patrol, firefighter, and the list goes on. In all of these endeavors, the primary function was to be of use to my fellow human being. The second was perfectly selfish, and it was how to load up my experience to be of benefit to my readers. What can I learn, digest, translate, and then project to you in a constructive, entertaining, perhaps edifying way? And that's about as organized as I was at the beginning of this series of books. Other writers keep notes and try to figure out who's who and what did I do in the last book and all that. I don't do that at all. And that is quite clear by the beginning of my little chit chat here, where I gave away my hidden ace, which is that Joe Gunther biologically is approximately 92 years old. I don't care. I may be 92, but it's not what I see in the mirror. And I don't think it's what any of us sees in the mirror. If you're feeling engaged and that you want to roll your sleeves up and muckle with the world. And if I've ever seen a world that deserves muckling, it's right now. So these are stories about us, about you, about me, and I hope to the benefit of us all. Now, I want to make them entertaining. I don't want to stand up on a soapbox and wave my finger and say this is good and this is bad and these are the lessons I've learned. Instead, what I want to do is sort of throw these stories partially into your lap, and then you can fill in with your own experiences and your own memories and your own thoughts the three-dimensionality of the picture I'm presenting. It's a risky endeavor. It is an energizing endeavor for me and keeps me fresh book after book after book, because a lot of people would say, my God, man, you've written 32 books about the same people. I don't know about you, but that sounds incredibly boring. Well, the idea is don't do that. Try to keep it fresh every book. And so far, I haven't had too many people, family, relatives notwithstanding, saying that I haven't put them to sleep yet. I will now, blessedly, lapse into stone cold silence so that I can actually be of use to somebody out there who might have a question that I can now address. So there you have it.
Okay, so audience, you should see a raise hand thing at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And we will, Matt will call on the people, and I will unmute them. Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor.
I have no idea what I just said, but you're very welcome.
All right, I think we have a first question. Kate Woolner, are you ready to ask a question?
Yes.
Please do.
Okay. So this is a very topical question. I know that the police chief in Brattleboro recently released a pretty decent statement about Black Lives Matter, et cetera, et cetera. I'm wondering, given that, you know, your works center around law enforcement, has what's happening today influenced at all your thinking about how you might write about law enforcement going forward?
Yes and no. I have 15 years of law enforcement in my background as well, and although working in Vermont really parallels no experience anywhere else, we're a kinder, gentler, smaller, less populated state, and I'm not even in the most seriously populated part of the state. So there are about 3 of us for every square mile. So policing in my neck of the woods is hardly daunting. All that having been said, my training and the people with whom I interact in law enforcement, because as a death investigator for the medical examiner's office, I'm still very much in cahoots with those guys. I was trained and believe strongly that every encounter with law enforcement is a public relations opportunity. One should always depart from those encounters with a feeling of enhancement, that the system worked, that redressment was appropriate and accurate. I've actually put handcuffs on people who thanked me because they felt like they were going off the rails, and I firmly but gently put them, started the process that might rectify that. That's a good day. It wasn't 100% of the time, but it was a good day. And people like Gunny Fitzgerald, the police chief you alluded to, comes from that cut of cloth, as do his people around him. Is it perfect? Of course it's not perfect, but these guys were so ahead of the game, it's risible. And when he or I or anybody else with a heart in their chest takes a look at some of the videos we've been exposed to, despite a background in law enforcement, we can only be appalled. And so, needless to answer your question, needless to say, when I began 14 decades ago to write the Joe Gunther series, I had templated that kind of cop. That's why I made Joe Gunther the kind of character he is, and that's why he runs a squad, and he was always the squad leader. He runs a squad where populated with 3-dimensional human beings, including the likes of Willie Kunkel, who is nobody's sweetheart, but he manages them, and he sometimes has to pull them up by the leash, as is what they deserve. So I don't see myself changing that too terribly much, because that was my intention from the start. And I hope that as we all witness changes, I hope there are changes that begin to be enacted, that they will merely parallel the world I envisioned in this series of novels. Feel free to follow up your question so that I can be a little more targeted. I know I'm a mouthy fellow, so I sometimes miss the pointedness of your question, and I don't want to do so. So let me know if I've answered your question or not.
Yes.
Now you're showing off, make me sound even mouthier than I am. Okay, I'll try to go New England and just go yep and nope from now on.
Well, we'll allow for the possibility for a follow-up. But for now, Joan and Steve Stoya, do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yes, thank you. I'm so glad to have you with us. Um, I I think my question is a variation of what Kate just asked, and that was, aside from the law enforcement dimension, how is working with rural characters um, attractive to you? What are their, how is that really different than talking about or creating characters who live in New York City?
Well, the easy answer is I live here, and I don't live in New York City. So I'm writing about, that old English class adage or writing class adage, write what you know. Now, I have lived in New York City. I lived in Los Angeles. I've lived in a lot of big cities, but that was a long time ago. And if I'm writing stories that reflect the here and now, more or less, uh, I better stick with what I do know, and what I do know is Vermont and whatnot. Now I visit in the books. I'll travel. I'll have Joe go to Boston or New York or Chicago or Montreal or Quebec or whatever. Uh, and I go to those places and I absorb what I see. But of course, I'm doing it with a rural eye. Joe is like me in Vermont, from Vermont, and therefore I want to bring his sensitivity and his viewpoint to bear. So I'm sort of out of my depths unless I wanted to actually place a book, let's say in New York City. Uh, I did so with a book called The Sniper's Wife many, many years ago, where Willie Kunkel, an appropriately dysfunctional person, went to, what I would consider a somewhat dysfunctional city, because I consider all cities dysfunctional. So that's one of the reasons I live up in Vermont. I wanted to get away from this sort of overly clotted civilization. Um, the other reason that I write about rural folks in a way is because, and this runs to your question, I want to extract the individuality of my characters, whereas if I placed them in a city of 6 million, that extraction process is constantly jammed. It's like having a private conversation in an elevator with 15 people. In Vermont, it's an emptier elevator, and you can actually focus on the conversation and not get too distracted or repressed by the presence of a lot of accessory people. And I write stories that take place in an environment that is unaccessorized by those extra people. So, in a funny kind of way, it's an apple and orange comparison. Again, I have no idea if I answered your question.
Yes, yes, you did. But if I may do a follow-up,
Of course.
we're all familiar with some Vermont characters from television. Larry, my brother Daryl, my other brother Daryl.
Yes.
How do you ever have to sort of check yourself to make sure you're not making your characters stereotypes?
Oh God, no. I mean, I'm part of that culture. That's what I do. When I'm not writing, I'm responding. I have a pager on my belt. I go out the door all the time, and interact. I no longer arrest them, but I spend time with them. As a death investigator, I'm out all the time, and I meet people in crisis. I meet people at their most real, shall I say. They are grieving, they are confused, they are angry, they are upset, they are in need, they are complicated. They ain't Larry, Harry, and Daryl, or whoever those guys were. I remember there were several Daryls. Um, I don't know that I've met a Daryl. I may have pronounced one dead, but he's lost to memory. Uh, nah, stereotypes are not interesting.
Mhm,
Complicated, three-dimensional, counterintuitive, paradoxical people. Those are interesting.
mhm, mhm,
I've already got Joe Gunther. Joe Gunther is pretty predictable. I don't want more Joe Gunthers.
mhm,
And he's not the simplest meal on the plate either.
mhm.
He's had his problems. Uh, I've actually had some women come up to me and say, "Oh, I love Joe Gunther," and I went, "That's a very dangerous thing for you to say," because his love life is terminal. Uh, so that this is a guy who, although he is sort of salt of the earth and no one's special baggage of pain, he has nevertheless had his bumps.
Mhm.
And he's had some perfectly terrible things happen to those nearest and dearest to him. I want all of those in those books, and if I am guilty of writing caricatures, let me know and I'll stop. I don't think I've been doing that. I certainly strive not to.
Very
Uh,
good. Thank you so
yeah.
much. Appreciate your comments.
Yeah, that is a great explanation of the complexity of characters. Wendy Bramble, do you have a question you'd like to share? Wendy, are you there?
Oh, sorry about that. Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I put people to sleep all the time, but okay.
All right, am I on?
Yes.
Okay, great. I actually am way back in some of your earlier pieces. I just learned about you, and it's dangerous because I'm hooked.
Oh,
But
I'm delighted.
but
Thank
I have a couple of questions. So I just finished The Dark Root, and it was very interesting to hear about all of this Chinese things happening in Vermont. It, was that based on a lot of fact, and are a lot of your books taken from tidbits that you find in the newspaper, and then you blow it up to the story that you see it as?
Absolutely. Oh yeah. So on that occasion, I'm sitting in the office with the Vermont State Police intelligence officer. This is many, many, many years ago. He's long since retired. I'm the only one who never gets to retire. So these are generations of troopers and investigators come and go.
Mhm.
Uh, and given that it's Vermont, and given that these are the realities that we all deal with up here, he is, in fact, the only member of the intelligence unit. He's the entire unit, and the office is so big that I'm in his guest chair and he's in his official chair, and we're almost sitting knee to knee. So this is an intimate encounter. Uh, and I turned to him and I said, "Look, Bill, you are, I mean, all cops are paranoid because that's what they're paid to do. I mean, they put on a bullet resistant vest before they go to work. So if you're not paranoid, you're stupid. Uh, but you, Bill, are the paranoid's paranoid, because as an intel officer, you need to think even ahead of what's visible on the horizon. You need to go over that and see what's coming. What do you see that's coming?" And I thought I was being very, very fancy, a very New York journalist with this question. And he looked at me without hesitation and he said, "Oh, Asian crime." Good thing we were sitting knee to knee because I was ready to fall off my chair laughing. I said, "Bill, there are 3 Asians in the entire state. Give me a break." Uh, and he said, "No, no." And he told me a story with which, with a few changes, I began the book.
Mm.
He was in traffic. He was passed at high speed by a car. He pulled him over, and there were 3 males in the car. And he spoke to the driver, But as any good cop should do, he interviewed or chatted with all four of the occupants, and he gathered their information, which you're also supposed to do, just to find out with whom you're interacting. All four, or each of the four, came from different parts of the country. They were all Asian, but they didn't know each other. And they were headed to Canada. Now, there was no reason other than the speeding ticket to stop them. So, that done, he let them go. The punchline is that 2 days later, since he was also the intel officer, he got the telex a couple of days later that 4 Asians were suspected of having eliminated a fella in Chinatown in Montreal. And he put 2 and 2 together and compared some notes with the Montreal police, and sure enough, it was the same 4 guys. It was a hit squad. And that really got my interest, as you can well imagine. So I stole that and put it to use. That's a perfect exemplar of how I will poke around and look into the realities of the here and now. Of course, like I said, this was 7 years ago, and take advantage of them. Now, since this guy was the intel officer and he was looking ahead, when I wrote the book, I mentioned earlier that I write the book a year. They take so a couple of years down the line, the book comes out. This is the dark route again, to go back to your question. 1 week, 2 weeks after the book came out, there was an Asian home invasion in Upper New England. And a journalist calls me up and says, "My God, man, how do you do that? Did you do that in disguise? What's going on?" And I said, "No. And in fact, just so you know, you're calling a writer of fiction. I make this stuff up. So leave me alone and do your journalistic homework." And that was sort of the end of the phone call. But it goes to show you, as they say, that sometimes I hit it pretty close. And it's because I do spend a lot of time with the people in the trenches, and I want to find out what they're doing and how they're doing what they do. When I finish each one of these manuscripts, by the way, I always give it to at least one, if not several, law enforcement officers to proofread, to make sure that the protocols, the procedures, and the issues are up to date.
That makes sense. Can I ask another question?
Of course.
This is actually more personal. Norm Runyon and I were friends. We're both unipressors. And so I laughed out loud when I saw that he was the detective in your book.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you had worked for him, and if you use many people who using him as a detective to me was almost a homage to where he started out. So do you use a lot of names of people that you know?
Every book I've written has at least a few real people's names. As for fun, it's for the benefit of auction winners. The left pawed, bent-eared puppy society wants to raise some money. They contact me and they say, will you put a character into one of your books so that we can auction it off? I will agree to that with the proviso that I get to do anything I want, anything with the winner of the name. I don't want to meet him. I don't want to have lunch with him. I don't want to know it. I just want the name. And then I will do unspeakable things if I feel like it with that name. With that understanding, they give me names. So there's Norm. He won a prize or something. But Norm and I go way back. Norm was, to the uninitiated, the longtime editor of the Brattleboro Reformer, whose provenance was very high scale. He was a heck of a journalist and was in the cutting edge of 1960s and 70s journalism. And then he sort of semi-retired, and he came to Brattleboro and really had a crackerjack crew writing articles for him at the Reformer. He was a colossal egomaniac, or could be on occasions, and wonderfully so. And everyone would say that directly to his face. So
Absolutely.
yeah, no problem there.
No.
He was not only aware of it, he was proud of it. So he turned around, and when my first book or two came out, he put me on the front page of both sections. So it was a double header. And then forever after, he said that he had made me what I am today. Unfortunately, he gave up the ghost and died on us, which was quite thoughtless. But he was a heck of a nice guy, and I used him as a source and his people as well. But in the guise of the character name thing, I made him a detective in Chicago, and I gave him a rough time. I had a few things land on his head, and he had to go to the hospital as a character and whatnot. And apparently he was reading, his wife at the time was reading the book next to him in bed, and she goes, yeah, suddenly
Okay.
take a breath.
Yeah.
And Norm turned sort of harshly on her, because he knew that she was reading my book, and it was the book with his name in it. And he said, and you'll just have to forgive my French, but he said, "That son of a bitch, he didn't kill me off, did he?" And I hadn't.
Oh, those are great questions, Wendy. Thank you. Christopher Kloss, do you have a question you wanted to ask?
There we go. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so I'm a teacher. I used to teach in Brattleboro. Now I teach in Keene. And I've always, since I lived in Brattleboro, been reading the Joe Gunther series completely out of order. And I decided a few years ago, I need to go back. But I just didn't have the time or the funds to buy 30 books starting from number one. So I've started using my local library, which has been great. And I got through maybe the first 10 or 12 or so that they had there, almost all of them right in a row. Was just falling in love with the characters again. And then the voice actor switched from Tom Taylorson to the guy that does Bob the Builder, and it crushed me. And I cannot find the next section with Tom Taylorson's voice on it, and I feel like I need it. Like I have to just go back to reading it again. I can't listen to it on my way to and from work like I had been. I was just really curious about, what is the process of picking voice actors? Does Tom Taylorson still do one that just the libraries can't find?
It's sort of beyond my control. Publishers, be they audio, visual, whatever, they buy the property, and they sort of sit in the driver's seat. They get to pick who they pick. And there was one occasion where, and I can't remember the names anymore, and I believe the guy has died anyhow, so he's presently unavailable. There was one reader that both my wife and I objected to. It was just way too hammy, and at that point, I actually made a phone call and said, can I actually, put a vote in that I'm not crazy about this whoever this was? And they said, "Oh, sure, yeah, no, not a problem." So that change was, but that's the only time I put my oar in the water and affected any kind of change.
Yeah, good question there too. Cindy Bell, do you have a question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Well done.
All right. I'm trying to learn how to
You could almost feel your fingers smashing on the keyboard going,
Yeah, there's the unmute button. I grew up in Brattleboro many, many years ago and left after I went to college, but I really someday want to go back. My family in history in Vermont goes way, way back. My dad's folks grew up in West Wardsboro, And I'm curious about, again, going back to picking names. I just finished reading The Second Mouse, and you had a character there. His name was Newell something or other. And I was just wondering why you picked that name, because that was my maiden name. So I my family there. Or,
yeah, 32 books in, remembering a single character's name from a previous book is going to be a trifle daunting.
okay, well, you live in Newfane. My brother's Tim Newell. He lives in Brookline. I didn't know if you guys might have crossed paths somewhere.
Wonderful.
My brother's in West Wardsboro, and I was just curious, what
Entirely possible.
the name.
It
Yeah.
was. I mean, I'm knee deep in conversation with people all the time. I love odd name, and I do strive to go for local names. So who knows?
And we have a question from Rhoda Yukovic.
Oh, hi. Hi. I just wondered about Willie. He's such an odd character. I mean, he's always kind of interests me. How did you find him? Or he's been in there, I believe, since the beginning?
He has been there from the beginning. Suffice it to say, I've been in there from the beginning, and that's more than an odd coincidence. If you really want to know what makes Willie tick, I see him in the mirror every morning. So,
Okay.
yeah, no, that's why he's one of the more complex, occasionally controversial, fellas around. I ain't Joe. Joe is a wonderful human being in many respects. I only wish I could be confused with Joe. But my own daughter once shook her head sorrowfully and said, "Doesn't anybody know that you're really Willie?" So Willie is many people's favorite. And in part, it is because with Joe's help, we can all witness his struggle. Here is a man whose integrity is unbeatable, whose heart is there for the duration. But his means of expression are a little quirky. So when he steps in it pretty big. And he's the kind of guy that you just want to give him a dope slap half the time. And the other half of the time you want to cheer for him because, well, let's put it this way. How many times have you been in a business meeting and there's your boss, blah, 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 blah. It's kind of like those Peanut characters where all the adults just go, wah, 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 wah. And you're thinking to yourself, Mother of God, shoot me now. But somebody, maybe, or in your wildest imagination, you raise your hand and you tell your boss, that's the stupidest thing I've heard all day long. Willie will do that. That's why Willie's around. And I would argue, that's one of the reasons you like Willie. Because he'll do and say things that most of us are too inhibited or too polite to say. He's a wonderful character, and I think not because of the wonderful aspect, but he runs the most familiar to me.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. That is very insightful, the kind of thing we are lucky to get by being in actual conversation with you. Another question came through, being a death investigator is a pretty amazing job title. And you've talked somewhat about how your work in the field has informed the writing. I wonder if there are any circumstances in which the writing has informed the police work.
Yes, in a way. Well, for one thing, when I was a cop, I wrote one hell of an eloquent affidavit. I remember standing in front of a judge. I wanted to get inside. Well, I'll get to the death investigator soon, but as a cop, I wanted to get in. So I did. My specialty in those days was sex crimes against kids the disadvantage. It's kind of like an SVU job, Vermont style. And I'm standing in front of the judge with an affidavit that I've crafted, trying to get into this guy's trailer so that I can find out what I need to find out. And I'm on kind of thin ice in terms of the affidavit, in terms of my probable cause. So it's all about the wording. And so I'm looking at her, looking at it. And she pauses and puts it back down on her desk, and she gives me that sort of hairy eyeball thing that judges are so good at. And she says, you can really tell you're a writer. Guess who got into the trailer? So yes, it's been very handy knowing how to craft the prose. In the medical examiner job, the death investigator job, I have benefited less because of the actual writing, although I write reports after every case. And I've done hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases. I mean, I've done this job for 18 years. So, seen a lot of action along those lines. And every exposure results in a written report. So I like to think that I, present a readable report. More importantly, these are investigations. I need to get in there and find out, the job is to find out what killed them. What happened? What were all the tabs and the slots and the ABCs and everything that influenced the case? There will always be unanswered questions, but they better not be big ones. Because if they're big ones, then I got to keep at it until I get an answer. That way of thinking is similar to the way I write. I problem solve. I figure out, okay, so if so-and-so does this and such does that, and how do they interact, and how, what might influence somebody to do something in some way versus another way. That analytical mindset, that process that I employ as a writer mirrors the process that I employ during investigations. So the symbiotic linkage is quite real, quite relevant.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for that. Barbara Moreau, do you have a question?
Yes, I do. Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello. Thank you for being here, Mr. Mayor. This is awesome. I had a question. You talked earlier about Joe's age, and I know he has aged into the 60s, I believe, early 60s, right? And the last book pretty much focused on Sally, the tag man's daughter, and Rachel was her name, the photographer, the journalist. So is that the direction you see this going, that Sally and Rachel will take over and Joe is like a what do you call it?
An old man leaning against the wall.
No, he's a resource and they're taking over. Is that the course that you're thinking?
Now, for one thing, you're presuming an intelligence on my part that defies reality. I'm not that clever, I'm not that far-seeing, and these are not that well calculated. I write each book as I write it. I don't go back, and I certainly have no idea which direction I'm going forward. So I wanted Sally and Rachel on board, to introduce some fresh blood. To give us some younger attitudes and outlooks. I like the fact they're young women, and to address the gender thing about the police procedurals. And all of that was useful to me and remains so. In fact, they're surfacing in the book that I'm writing right now, number 32. But they're not primary players. Funnily enough, the book that's coming out in the fall, The Orphan's Guilt by name, they feature fairly prominently in that. they're not going to feature too terribly prominently in the book I'm writing now, which I've tentatively titled Marked Man. It varies, in other words. I write the story, and the characters will fit in as they fit in and as they're appropriate. If a topic or I mean, not a topic, but if a plot occurred to me at some point that didn't reasonably fit Sally or Rachel, they wouldn't be in it. And on occasion, for example, Sally's father, Dan Kravitz, who was the tag man of title fame, he comes and goes periodically, and Sally and Rachel may come and go. I just don't know. It depends on how I feel. I like them both, and I like their energy. I like what they bring to bear, and I've gotten good feedback. So the customer participation is good, but I'm not planning on them taking over the series. No.
Oh, well, we all look forward to those next books. Barbara, thank you for that question. And Cindy Snow, you have your hand raised?
Yes, hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Great. So I want to, I know this might be sacrilege, but I'll diverge a little from literature. Sometimes we like to watch crime series on Acorn, like Foyle's War or Poirot,
Sure.
more
Yep.
recently Endeavor. And I wonder if there are any series that you have a lot of respect for, or if you even like that genre.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. No, I like the tall tales. And funnily enough, I don't read fiction or murder mysteries. But I see the advantage and the value of accessing it somehow or another. I used to, but when you do what I do professionally, and of course you write the kinds of books I write, curling up with a good murder mystery at the end of the day is not my idea of fun. However, watching it on TV, which sort of employs a different part of your brain, being a visual medium, that's terribly entertaining. And funnily enough, the ones you rattled off are the ones I'm going to orient myself to. I don't like the I was about to say I don't like the murder mysteries on TV that are sort of mindlessly violent or whatnot, but that misses the point. I guess what I go for, in a paradox, having just said that part of my brain for the visual versus the writing, I don't like things that aren't well written. And generally speaking, I will more and more be thrust into the world of the internet shows, like you mentioned, Netflix or Acorn or whatever, because then I can go far afield. And I'm very happy to watch Belgian programs or Polish programs or programs that no one's ever heard of. They all have subtitles, but the common denominator to them is that the writing is good and the characterization is key. The characters drive the plots. So if I look at CBS or NBC or whatever on TV, and I just see a lot of set pieces. Oh, here's the chase scene. Oh, here's the sex scene. Oh, here's the edgier chair scene. I'm not going to watch those. I find them predictable. I find them demeaning to the intellects of the viewers, and so I'm going to go elsewhere. But I like to do it. It's something I find quite useful to my work. Every once in a while, I'll steal. I'll see something on a program where there's what Alfred Hitchcock used to call a MacGuffin, and I'll steal a MacGuffin. Absolutely.
Yeah, no shame in that. Question from Paul Richmond.
Thanks. This has been great. Thank you so much for being here. And I'm going to have to read your books. I have to say that in terms. I wanted to ask you, because it's very unique. And in this world of when writers are trying to create an identity and people are so much into series and so many people watch the kind of things that you just were just talking about, where they almost want that predictability. And you've really stated over and over again today that you are, I'm if I got attached to some character named Bill, I may never hear of Bill again, and that you're not worried about that. And do you think that your readers are attracted to you because of that? That you've sifted out the crowd who wants to follow someone through 12 books, and they're not going to get that with your books, obviously, from what you've stated.
Well, they will and they won't, of course. You got Joe and Willie and whatnot, but those are almost like family. But you're quite right. I mean, imagine, as I did when I actually addressed this very question in my mind as a writer. Imagine how many times you have a conversation with someone, and by God, it's a good conversation. And that's an interesting person, and you think to yourself, "Wow, I found a little gold nugget here. I'd like to have more of these kind of conversations." But one thing leads to another. The dinner party comes to an end. You lost the card that had that guy's name on it, or whatever the hell it is, and they're gone. And okay, well, welcome to my world and my books, because my father used to say, always leave them wanting more. So I don't want a situation where my readers are so saturated and you so run out of character twitches, and that's all they were. They weren't, in fact, true personalities. They were just mannerisms. I've got several people who are reliable, and by people I mean characters who are reliable and go-to people. And the mention of Sally and Rachel, for example, are people that I'm aborning as we speak, and I'm trying to make them three-dimensional. But one of my techniques is to take my time. If you like my stuff, I'll keep it coming. For one thing, I need the employment. But the other thing is that I feel co-engaged with my readers, and I don't want to rush the process. So if you liked that person, then I'm going to give you the opportunity of several books to get to know them more and more and more. And even the old reliable characters who were in book number 1 and are still with us now 30 books later, I will never be shy about introducing some new character trait about them, just because it is the damnedest thing. You talk to your buddy of 15 years, and all of a sudden he or she lets slip something that they love, that they practice, and you go, I'll be damned. You grow garden? You like gardening? I never saw you in a garden. And it just sort of does something minute to your perception, but it enhances the experience of knowing that person. And I will always try to do that logically and reasonably in the context of these books.
We're getting such great insight here. We have time for just 1 or 2 more questions. A reminder to everybody, if you have a question, please use the raise hand function and I'll be able to call on you. Cindy Snow, do you have another question?
Yes, I do. And it relates to what you were just saying. In the Recorder, there was an interview with you just recently, and you said that you don't use the material from real, from your day work investigating around murders. You don't use real stories in your fiction. And I wondered how you do that, because it seems very respectful. This is murder and people dying for, really. But how do you avoid grabbing stuff from real life when you're writing fiction?
Well, if you see it as unethical, you're not going to make that mistake, because it simply is unethical, and you're not inclined to go that way. So it's an instinct in me. Now, since there are always exceptions to every rule, here there's one exception, which I'll explain in a moment, but there is one clarification, and that is there's a difference between a case in its beginning, middle, and end, which is a three-dimensional entity, and life. Okay, now the two of them are absolutely integral. But you can talk about life till you're blue in the face, that's fine. You should not discuss a case, in my context, in the realm of fiction, because that's disrespectful, it's unprofessional, and it's just plain rude. People suffered loss. And it's not for me to milk that for my own advantage. Now, there have been situations where I have done an investigation and I have not been able to bring it to rights. You guys will see this on TV, on the news all the time, where everybody knows goddamn well who did it. Okay, somebody committed a crime, but that person was never prosecuted for that crime, or if so, the prosecution fell apart and the verdict was not guilty. And yet you know, and everyone knows, that there's not going to be any further investigation. It just so turned out that the guy either got away or he got off. That's real. And I've been in those situations. But I, unlike most people, I have a revenge. I can then take that case, change the location, change the people, change the circumstances, and solve it in fiction. And I do that. I have done that. I don't make a regular practice of it. I'd say I've done that 2 or 3 times at the most. But it's satisfying because I can tell you that between rescue calls, police investigations, death investigations, I mean, I've now done thousands of these things, call them emergency responses of one sort or another. And at every emergency response, you need to traffic manage, decision make, you need to sort out the details. And it is really satisfying to be able to at least personally and privately address the frustration of not bringing that boat to harbor in an accurate way. It's every investigator, well, it should be, maybe it isn't, it should be every investigator's biggest irritation is to not be able to wrap up the case successfully, one way or the other. I mean, maybe the guy gets off and that's fine, but you know that you did your end. And so I have this outlet. I have this ability to take those cases fully knowing that I can't do anything with them in reality and address them in fiction.
Mr. Mayor, this is a fascinating conversation. It is 2 o'clock and I don't want to keep people long. So if I could just ask a final question for you today. I wonder what kind of feedback is your favorite kind of feedback from readers?
Well, you know, you learn through your failures, and it's just wonderful to get a thumbs up from people. But it's fascinating for me to have someone come up to me and say, you know, I had a problem with this last one. This guy, this plot twist, this development, this something. And a lot of people, you know, my editor or my agent or someone might say, "Oh, well, you know, let's keep that under wraps." I'm inclined to give that more attention than the applause, because you do learn through your mistakes. That's how you get better. And I am imperiled in a way because I've stuck with the same characters for so many years. And therefore I need to be twice as aware and respectful of other people's insights. Now, if they just say, I don't like, old guys who wear glasses, well, they're fine. That I don't learn through that. But if they have something constructive to bring to the table, I will always listen to that.
Mr. Mayor, thank you so much for being here. We are super grateful to have had this opportunity to have a conversation with you. And to everybody out there joining this conversation, thank you also for being here. You can find more about Mr. Mayor at archermayor.com. And don't miss us in the next 2 weekends, next 2 Saturdays, for more of the Authors and Artists Festival. Thank you, everybody. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being here today.
Very welcome, and best of luck with your festival.